What's up, guys? RotoDoc here. Just wanted to go over two of my lineups from the past weekend, the Coca-Cola 600 slate, two of my NASCAR DFS lineups, so you guys can kind of understand my process, what I go through each week when I'm trying to make some lineup decisions. And so I did win the $200,000 fantasy racing World Championship qualifier number 2. There were 3 this weekend. And I almost qualified for one, or for almost qualified twice, I should say. I qualified once, and the second one I was leading going into the second to last lap when Jimmy Johnson ran out of fuel. So that would have been nice to get a second one. It wouldn't have given me a second entry into the tournament, but DraftKings would have given me the cash value for that, which is $8,000. So that would have been nice. So lost out on $8,000 there. But I did win a World Championship, Fantasy Racing World Championship qualifier, which is great. There's one entry max per person, so I'm glad to have filled my quota in week 1. This is the third time I've qualified for the NASCAR main event on DraftKings. I had 2 entries into the main event the very first year they ran it back in 2015. Didn't get any last year, although I was really close several times. And then this year I got one the very first week, and they only, like I said, are letting you do 1 maximum entry. So I was glad to get that the first week. Definitely fortunate, but I also, I'll go through my strategy and how I did that. In other news, we had the 300,000 Beast tournament. So big congrats to BD Holla 89. He's one of my DFS friends in the industry. He's a really great guy. Awesome DFS player, and he took down yet another big tournament. Really great lineup. I'm going to go over his lineup as well. But first, like I said, I'm going to go over my best and worst lineups from the Beast here, or I should say my best lineup from the qualifier, my worst lineup from the Beast. So we'll definitely talk about that. But first, let's definitely start with the big qualifying winning lineup so we can talk a little bit about theory, a little bit about my win there. So the biggest thing that, I had going for me there was fading Kyle Larson. So I'm going to talk about that decision. Obviously, I wrote up Kyle Larson as a GPP play of mine, and I played him 100% in my Beast lineups. So I made 150 lineups in the Beast. I had Kyle Larson in 150 of them. So you can't chide me for not playing Kyle Larson. I definitely had a huge amount of exposure to him, but you also have to construct your lineups for the actual contest you're playing, and that was the key to winning the qualifier here. Kyle Larson, if we just go click through some of these, I think second place even had Kyle Larson. You can see NS Mafia, who's a great player. He also ended up winning one of the qualifiers in the qualifier number 3 there, the $1,000 buy-in qualifier with Kyle Larson in that lineup, actually. But he had Kyle Larson in his lineup there and finished second. We could see Kyle Larson was 83.6% owned. And in a contest where there's only 67 entries and Larson is 83.6% owned, that means there's only 11 people who did not have Kyle Larson. So if Kyle Larson had major troubles and finished as he did, 33rd, then it was most likely that the winning lineup would come from those 11 entries. So what I did is I essentially faded Kyle Larson completely in qualifiers because you only win the qualifier if you finish first place. So the difference between that and the Beast is the Beast still paid, how many places did it pay? The Beast still paid 105,070 places. So, even if Kyle Larson wrecked, but if 67% of the people in the Beast had him, there's still plenty of chances for me to cash, even with Kyle Larson at 100% exposure there. Whereas, if he crashes here in a 67-person tournament where only first place wins, then it's most likely that I'm not going to win if I do have Kyle Larson. Even if I did have Kyle Larson and he was in the winning lineup, then I'd still have to compete with, 56 other people in essentially a 5 versus 5, because if everybody else had Kyle Larson and he did great, then it's a 5-on-5. There's only 5 other drivers to fill out your roster. So I took the approach that NASCAR is a highly variable sport. Wrecks happen, problems happen, things happen, penalties, blown engines, tire failures, all these things you can't predict. I mean, look at what we saw early in the race with Jeffrey Earnhardt, part of his car coming off. into Chase Elliott's car, which broke Chase Elliott's car. Chase Elliott suddenly slowed, and Brad Keselowski had nowhere to go, plowed right into the back of Chase Elliott. That wasn't Chase Elliott's fault. That wasn't, Keselowski's fault. That's just things that happen. That's the randomness of NASCAR. So when a driver is 83.6% owned, I will always fade him in a qualifier. And I could figure he would be that high. I figured he would be that highly owned because he was the only driver of that quality starting that far back. I mean, we've talked about this in the podcast last week, where in past weeks where you had guys like Jimmy Johnson starting in the back, you also had Clint Boyer, Dale Jr., Eric Jones, etc. A lot of drivers to use there, which helped keep Johnson's ownership depressed a little bit, around that 55 to 60% mark in big GPPs. And maybe around 70% in what would be more like a qualifier or higher stakes scenario. Well, I figured Kyle Larson would be upward of 80% owned in the higher stakes qualifiers. So actually in the $1,000 qualifier, I entered that. There were only 8 entrants. He was 100% owned. I did use him there. That was the only place I used Kyle Larson. Sorry, one of 2 lineups I used Kyle Larson out of 12 qualifying entries. There was also a $33 contest where I could enter 9. There was this $150 contest where I could enter 2, and then there was the $1,000 where I could enter 1. And I figured if there was one spot for me to enter Kyle Larson, it would be in one of my 9 or in my $1,000 entry tournament, and that's because he was 100% owned there. Only 8 people, so I only needed to beat 7 others anyway in a 5-on-5, and I figured Kyle Larson would be 100% owned in that one. So that's kind of what it came down to there. But in this one, made sense to fade Kyle Larson completely. Went 0 of 2 on Kyle Larson, and like I said, I had 2 of the 11 non-Kyle Larson spots. So that essentially right there gives me a huge chance to qualify if Kyle Larson does have a problem. I was fortunate he did have problems, no doubt about that. But when I ran the numbers earlier this week, and I talked about it on the podcast, there was still about a 20% chance that Kyle Larson would have a serious problem. The average is about 22%, and give him maybe a couple extra percent because he's a little bit better of a driver than the average in maybe avoiding problems. And then, so let's say there's about a 20% chance Kyle Larson, had a serious problem. Then, even if he didn't have a serious problem, there's maybe a 5% chance he doesn't end up in like some kind of winning lineup position, like he gets a really late race penalty and finishes 28th or something like that. That might not be good enough to be in the winning lineup. So, I said about a 25%. So if I figured he'd be north of 75%, I would fade him. And in this case, I wanted to get as much leverage as possible because I didn't just want to finish high up. I wanted to win. So the only way to get that much leverage is to fade him completely. So that's what I did. Did not use Kyle Larson, and it turned out well. So I like I said, I built 2 lineups, and I just varied my dominators. In one, I had Harvick, Elliott, and McMurray. I thought McMurray actually had a very outside chance at dominating. He did move forward. He was up in 3rd place at one point. Very fast car. Just didn't work out for him in the end. And obviously, I talked about what happened with Chase Elliott. But in the other one, I had Truex, Harvick, and Kyle Busch. So Harvick was my only repeat. He was kind of the safe pick to lead some laps there. And these 3 drivers were the 3 that actually led the most laps: Kyle Busch, Kevin Harvick, and Truex. So I got lucky there that it worked out that way. But, that ensured I got the dominators covered in my 2 lineups. And it worked out that, Truex and Kyle Busch were in the same one. So, that covers those 3. I also had Corey LaJoie. He was just salary relief so that I could get Truex, Harvick, and Kyle Busch, who are all over 10K, into the same lineup, and it made sense. Corey LaJoie didn't make a qualifying run. He started 40th. He was up in the 20s, 28th, 27th at different points in the race. He was running very well. Ended up having a late race problem, finished 32nd, but I think his salary was $4,800. Yeah, it was $4,800. So for $4,800, I got 20 points, which is not a terrible return on my investment, especially considering it allowed me to get these 3 guys, Harvick with 51.25 points, and then Kyle Busch and Martin Truex Jr., who combined for, let's see if I can do the math on the fly here, 240 points there. So, that's the benefit of LaJoie here in this lineup, was it allowed me to get 240 points just from Truex and Kyle Busch, and also get Harvick into the lineup. Then I rounded out my lineup with some just 2-place differential guys. AJ Allmendinger started 26th, ended up finishing 18th. The reason I liked him was because he practiced better than he qualified. So he qualified 26th, but he was practicing in the in the mid-teens. And so I figured he had a car that could make up several place differential spots. He had a problem early, but ended up recovering to finish one lap down, and that was good enough for an 18th place finish. If he didn't have that early problem, I think he probably had a top 15 car. And then obviously Austin Dillon ran solid all race. Charlotte's a very good track for him. He as well practiced better than he qualified. So again, another driver that practiced in the teens, and I figured with his track history, he probably could also just race even better than he practiced. Got lucky in the fuel strategy department, but he was right up there, in a positive place differential format all day. So that kind of rounded out my roster. It was really good to get Austin Dillon in there with Truex and Kyle Busch to kind of complete the trio of just huge point scorers. So that led to my highest score. I won the qualifier by over 30 points. So definitely just one of those rosters that kind of fell together almost perfectly, and glad it worked out that way. Certainly benefited from some luck there, but obviously the key was fading Kyle Larson in these qualifiers. So if you guys are entering any qualifiers, and really pay attention to the structure of the format. If it's a winner take all, do things that will get you leverage so that you will be the winner. In this case, for me, it was 100% fade of Kyle Larson. I would do it again, even if Kyle Larson was in the winning lineup, because, like I said, he was 83.6% owned, but I figured there was about a 20 to 25% chance he wouldn't even end up in the winning lineup. And that was, far better than what the field was banking on, which was like 16.4%. So if you just take 100 minus the 83.6% he was owned, it's about 16.4% there. So that's why I went with the complete fade. It's a winner-take-all format, and you got to go for the win. So that's what I did there. Let's talk about my worst lineup. This was in the Beast, of course, where I went 100% Kyle Larson, and he was only 66.6% owned here. And as I talked about, I thought there was maybe a 75% chance he would end up in the winning lineup. So kind of like the game theory optimal GTO strategy would be to have him around that 75%, 80% range that I recommended on the podcast and figured he would end up with his probability. So I wanted just some extra leverage, especially because I was fading him in the qualifier. So I just went 100% on him. And then, figured if he had a great day, I'd be in good shape to have a chance to just crush in the Beast. And if he had a bad day, well, that would be good for me because I'd get a chance to qualify. So that's also a way for me to hedge my bet there a little bit on Kyle Larson. So obviously Kyle Larson didn't work out, and that was kind of where my lineup started. I also had a ton of exposure to Chase Elliott. I was over 50% on Chase Elliott, and I wrote him up in my GPP plays, and this was just a play where I really liked Chase Elliott this week. I liked him. My model liked him. I liked him. The Sim Scores app liked him. Everything was pointing toward a Chase Elliott type race. And it just didn't work out. He didn't get that initial restart that I thought on the very beginning. He started to fall back a little bit. He had a great long run car, but he didn't really get a chance to show it because, 19 laps into the race, his car ended up getting some problems there from that Jeffrey Earnhardt part failure, and then Brad Keselowski, I should say, ran into the back of Chase Elliott, and that ended his day right there. So he didn't get a chance to show his long run speed. And never really had a chance to do much with it. So that play didn't work out, but I was definitely happy with getting a lot of exposure to Chase Elliott at only 19.5% owned. I figured a lot of people would be on, obviously, Kyle Larson as an expensive driver, but also Kyle Busch, Kevin Harvick, Martin Truex, and they were all 25% plus owned. Harvick up around 40, and I think a couple other people, like I said, Kyle Busch was in the 30% range. So I figured that would bring Chase Elliott's ownership down, and that did, and I was definitely happy to get him at 19.5%. Just didn't work out. Ryan Blaney, obviously when I'm making a lot of Chase Elliott lineups, over 80 of them, for example, in 150 max enter, you're going to have different dominators that you want to combine them with. So I combined them with Blaney in this one. I thought there was a chance, given how Blaney ran in the Xfinity race, given the fact that he was fastest in the single lap, which I didn't put a ton of stock in. I actually didn't have much Blaney exposure. I was right around the 10% exposure, 13% exposure that the field had him. But I figured, obviously, I wanted a little bit of exposure to him, and he just didn't quite have the car as well, and also ended up having some issues. Case Kane also had some issues. He started 24th. He was, running better than 24th at various points in the race, but obviously you never want to see the upside-down car logo. I had 4 upside-down car logos. The other one was Corey LaJoie, as we talked about, who had a late race problem there. 15% owned. I like that play a lot. Just, again, that one actually didn't hurt too much because he still got 20 points at 4,800. Then my last 2 plays, I talked about Case Kane. My last play was Jamie McMurray there. Again, kind of a contrarian dominator. I didn't have much Jamie McMurray exposure. I think I had right around 15. I think maybe I was at like 17% exposure on McMurray. I wanted a tiny bit of leverage. And so didn't work out. He had a strong car, as I mentioned, but didn't work out on that fuel strategy and different things like that. So that was definitely my worst lineup. Let's go over BD Hala's winning lineup. 437 points. The only one to have this lineup. He crushed it. The key, of course, was AJ Allmendinger at 9.3% owned. I had a lot of Allmendinger as well. I had him about 20 to 25% owned, I think, in this Beast tournament. Really liked Allmendinger starting 26th, and don't know why he was down there at 9%. That's definitely an interesting get, and I would have had probably more exposure to him if I knew he was only going to be 9% owned. We talked about Kyle Busch, Austin Dillon, and Martin Truex Jr. Those 3 were some of the higher scoring guys. Austin Dillon, of course, winning the race there, starting from 22nd and winning. And then the other 2 plays were interesting. Dale Earnhardt Jr., I had a decent amount of exposure to Dale Earnhardt Jr., somewhere in the 20 to 25% neighborhood as well. He was very happy with his car. He tweeted about it, how Jimmy Johnson helped get his car ready there, and he was super happy after final practice. So I really put a lot of stock in Dale Jr. having a good race, and he did. And then Ryan Newman was an interesting one. I wasn't really on Newman. I had a bit of exposure to him, not much, maybe 5%. And that was simply I ran out of room to get exposure to different drivers. Ryan Newman was another driver that practiced better than he qualified in both post-qualifying practice sessions. I just didn't have as much exposure to him, but that was also a nice key to the win there, 17% owned. And that helped BD Hala have a unique lineup with 4 drivers under 20% owned, including 1 under 10% owned and 1 under 15% owned right there. So just an awesome lineup. Good job, BD Hala. That was an impressive feat there to win your second major GPP this year. So one other thing I just wanted to talk about real quick, because I was like I said, I was in this Fantasy Racing World Championship qualifier. I had 2 entries, neither with Kyle Larson. And there were 11 people total who didn't have Kyle Larson. I just wanted to pull up the 11 that didn't have him. So these are the 11 entries, and if we sort by name, we'll see I had 2 of those, and there was only one other, this Utex guy, who had 2 Kyle Larson free entries, so without Kyle Larson. And his dominator choices were Jimmy Johnson, Kyle Busch, and Matt Kenseth in one. Although Jimmy was sort of a dominator, I'd kind of consider him one. He started 14th. And then another one, Harvick, Kenseth, and Keselowski. So I wasn't a big Keselowski guy. I wrote him up as a fade, but he did kind of a similar strategy where he varied his dominators. His similar one there was Kenseth, which I thought was a little too contrarian maybe, given the fact that you're already fading Joey Logano. Already fading Kyle Larson. Kenseth was pretty low owned. Let's go see what he was in that, what his ownership percentage was there. But it was 10%. So I don't think you needed to go 10% on Kenseth. Also, you had Boyer in both lineups at 10%. So maybe a little too contrarian for only a 67-person GPP. But that's why you got to construct your roster with the tournament structure in mind, right? I faded Larson, which 83.6% of the field have. So I was almost guaranteed to have a unique lineup, given the fact that I was, doing 6-on-6 with 9 other people, other than myself, because I had 2 entries. And, I got Allmendinger at 11% in one of my lineups, but then in the other lineup, I didn't have Allmendinger, but I got McMurray at 9%. So yes, I had Harvick at 50% in both, and that's kind of what you want to do. If you're going to duplicate some guys, given the fact that I was fading Larson, made sense to duplicate the chalky guys. So that's going to do it. Really appreciate you guys tuning in. I hope you guys learned something today. If you end up entering some of these qualifiers, let me know, and I'll do my best, using the hashtag RVLive on the next RotoViz Live show to help construct some qualifier lineups. Not lineups, but give some advice on some different theory and things like that around the qualifiers. The other thing is, in the Beast, a lot of places paid out 10,000, so it made sense to have a lot of Kyle Larson exposure there. So that's just kind of the process behind, or the thinking behind my process there. Hope you guys learned something, and that's going to do it here. And I will talk to you guys later this week on RotoViz Live, and all the usual NASCAR content. See ya.